Welcome back to another IB Environmental Systems and Societies video. This is the second video in our ESS Internal Assessment series. In the previous video, we worked on developing your research question for Criterion A. Now we're moving on to Criterion B, which is called Strategy. Like Criterion A, this criterion is worth 4 of the 30 total marks allocated for the IA. Section B, Strategy, focuses on the human dimensions of environmental issues. This is where the and societies part of the ESS course becomes evident. Here's what might surprise you. Criterion B isn't about your research methodology. Instead, it's about exploring how different groups of people respond to environmental problems and why those responses sometimes conflict with each other. You'll be looking at real-world strategies that address your environmental issue, and you're going to examine the tensions that arise when different stakeholders have competing interests. Let's break down exactly what that means and how to approach it successfully for your IA. First, let's define what we mean by strategy in this context. A strategy is simply a course of action taken in response to an environmental problem or an issue. Think of it as a solution or a plan that someone has proposed or implemented to address a specific environmental challenge. For example, if climate change is the issue, building more wind turbines to generate renewable energy would be a strategy. If deforestation is the problem, creating a national park to protect forest habitat might be another strategy. If plastic pollution is the concern, implementing a citywide recycling program could be a different strategy. The strategy you describe can be something that already exists and is currently being used, or it can be a developing strategy, something that's been proposed but not fully implemented yet. Either way works for your internal assessment. Here's something really important that confuses many students. The environmental strategy you describe in Criterion B does not have to be the same thing you're investigating in your research question. Let me say that again. Your strategy can be different from what you're actually studying. However, the issue must have a clearly stated and credible connection to your research question. So if your research question investigates water quality near fish farms, your strategy could be about government regulations on fish farming, even though you're not directly studying those regulations. The connection between your investigation and the strategy needs to be clear and logical, but they don't have to be identical. This gives you some flexibility in choosing an interesting strategy to analyze. Criterion B has two distinct parts that you need to address. First, you need to describe an existing or developing strategy that addresses an environmental issue linked to your research question. The word describe here means that you need to provide enough detail that somebody reading your IA understands what the strategy is, who implemented it or proposed it, and how it's supposed to address the environmental problem. Second, you need to explain a tension between different perspectives that results from the strategy. These perspectives could be economic, social, cultural, political, or environmental. The word explain means you need to go deeper than just listing different viewpoints. You need to show why these perspectives conflict and what the consequences are that arise from that conflict. To earn full marks, you have to do both parts well. So let's explore each one in more detail. When describing your strategy, you have many options. You can discuss government policies like emission standards or fishing quotas. You could examine conservation programs like species reintroduction efforts or habitat restoration projects. You might analyze technological solutions like solar panel installations or water treatment systems. Or you could look at community initiatives like local beach cleanup campaigns or farmer cooperatives that are using sustainable practices. Whatever strategy you choose, make sure you can find reliable information about it. You'll need to explain what the strategy involves, who's responsible for it, where it's being implemented, and how it addresses the environmental issue. Government websites, environmental organization reports, news articles, and academic publications are all good sources for this kind of information. The more specific and detailed your description, the stronger your Criterion B is going to be. Now let's talk about stakeholders and perspectives. Stakeholders are people or groups of people who have an interest in the environmental issue and may be affected by the strategy in some way. Different stakeholders typically have different perspectives based on their economic situation, social position, cultural background, or their environmental values. For example, in a debate about protecting forest land, stakeholders might include logging companies worried about losing income, indigenous communities protecting sacred sites and traditional lands, local residents concerned about flooding if forests are cleared, government officials that are balancing economic development with conservation, and environmental organizations that are focused primarily on biodiversity protection. Each of these groups has legitimate concerns, but their priorities are going to conflict. That's where these tensions arrive. Tensions occur when different stakeholder groups have goals or needs that conflict with each other. These aren't just simple disagreements. They're fundamental conflicts that make it difficult to implement solutions that satisfy everybody. Let's look at a concrete example. Imagine a strategy to build a hydroelectric dam to generate clean energy. From an environmental perspective focused on climate change, this seems pretty positive. Renewable energy instead of fossil fuels. But from the perspective of local fishing communities, the dam disrupts fish migration patterns and threatens their livelihoods. From an economic development perspective, the dam brings jobs and electricity to rural areas. But from a cultural perspective, the dam might flood ancestral lands or sacred sites. There might also be a conflicting environmental perspective where people are worried about the downstream impacts from having such a large infrastructure project on a natural watercourse. These conflicting priorities create real tensions that affect whether and how the strategy gets implemented. That's what you need to explain in your IA. The ESS syllabus identifies ecocentric, anthropocentric, and technocentric perspectives as broad categories along a spectrum of worldviews. But the way people perceive environmental issues is influenced by several inputs: economic, social, cultural, political, and environmental context. Let's quickly define what each of those means. Economic perspectives focus on money, jobs, profit, costs, and financial impacts. Social perspectives relate to community well-being, health, education, and quality of life. Cultural perspectives involve traditions, values, beliefs, heritage sites, and ways of life. Political perspectives concern government policies, power dynamics, regulations, and government structures. Of course, environmental perspectives prioritize ecosystem health, biodiversity, pollution levels, and resource conservation. When identifying tensions in your IA, you're going to need to show how at least two of these different types of perspectives conflict with each other around the strategy that you've chosen. The tensions should be real and they should be significant, not superficial disagreements, but fundamental differences that affect how the strategy works in practice. There's an important difference between describing tensions and explaining them. Many students lose marks because they only describe what different groups think without explaining why those differences create real problems. A weak approach just lists the perspectives. Farmers want to use pesticides for higher crop yields, but environmentalists want to ban pesticides to protect wildlife. That's a description, but it's not an explanation. A stronger approach explains the underlying conflict and its consequences. Farmers depend economically on high crop yields to support their families and pay off loans, and that makes pesticides financially necessary in their view. However, environmentalists argue that pesticide runoff contaminates waterways and harms aquatic ecosystems. This tension has stalled government regulation because politicians fear both the rural unemployment and the environmental damage, and that leaves the issue unresolved. You see the difference? The second version explains why the tension matters and why it's important. The final step in Criterion B is showing how the tensions you've identified actually affect your chosen strategy or other potential solutions. This demonstrates that you understand environmental issues aren't just technical problems. They're complex situations that involve people with competing interests. How might tensions influence a strategy? They might delay implementation while stakeholders negotiate. They might lead to compromises that weaken the strategy's overall effectiveness. They might cause some groups to actively resist or undermine the strategy. They might result in unequal distribution of benefits and costs, or they might even inspire alternative strategies that attempt to address multiple perspectives at the same time. Whatever connections you make, be really specific about how the tensions you've identified create real-world consequences for addressing the environmental issue. To write a strong Criterion B section, you're going to need to research your chosen strategy and the tensions surrounding it. Where can you find this kind of information? Government environmental agencies often publish reports on policies and programs. NGOs like conservation groups provide perspectives on environmental strategies. News articles covering environmental debates reveal different stakeholder positions. Academic journals offer in-depth analysis of environmental conflicts. Local community groups and indigenous organizations might share perspectives that are often missing from official sources. As you research, take notes on specific examples, get quotes from stakeholders if you can, find data about the impacts, and then fully document all of those conflicts. These kind of details are going to make your explanation of tensions much more convincing. Remember to keep track of all of your sources because you're going to need to cite them in your final IA reports. Let's review what you need for a successful Criterion B. First, describe a specific strategy that addresses an environmental issue connected to your research question. Provide enough detail that readers understand what it is and how it works. Second, identify at least two different stakeholder perspectives from among economic, social, cultural, political, or environmental viewpoints. Third, explain the tensions between these perspectives, not just what people think, but why their interests conflict. Finally, show how these tensions affect the strategy or other solutions. In the next video, we're going to tackle Criterion C, your method, where you'll plan how you're actually going to conduct your investigation and collect your data. Until then, start researching strategies that are related to your environmental issue. And remember, happy learning.